The men didn't laugh quietly. They laughed with their boots on her porch, with the back of their throats, with the full weight of their mockery dripping into every sarcastic drawl. 3 of them, all neighbors of sorts, if you could call men neighbors who'd never once lifted a finger when her roof caved in the year prior, or when her boy got fevered and no one brought even a pot of snowmelt. They didn't come to help, but now that they'd seen the squat clay and rock thing rising out of the side of her cabin like some drunk idea of a chimney, they came all right, to laugh, to sneer, to remind her what a fool she looked building something like that with no man's guidance. It didn't help that she'd built it low to the ground near the floor, nor that she'd packed wet moss around the seams like some kind of rat's nest, and it certainly didn't help that she hadn't explained what she was building. She didn't need to. That was her mistake. Folks out here filled in the blanks with whatever made them feel superior. "Well, I'll be," one of them said, pulling a twig of dried chewed tobacco from his lip and flicking it into her snow-damp dirt. "That ain't even high enough to cook beans." "I seen mud ovens in Mexico," another chimed in. "But this here's just a buried smoke box. Reckon she'll gas herself before she warms the floor." She stood in the doorway then, arms crossed, face steady. Not angry, not ashamed, just firm. Her boy was behind her somewhere inside, asleep beneath a pile of stitched quilt and burlap sacks, and her daughter sat by the window quietly peeling the skins off last season's half-rotted apples. The stove glowed, not with fire, not yet, but with possibility, and that's what had kept her going through the long weeks of mud packing, digging, bracing the tunnel stove beneath her floor like a mole carving into solid frostbitten earth. Possibility and stubbornness. 2 things no man ever took from her. But she said nothing, not to them, let 'em laugh, because she knew what they didn't. What she'd figured out after the first 2 winters nearly took her children. What her dead husband never told her, probably never thought of, and what no preacher nor settler nor soldier had taught her. That heat didn't rise unless you made it. That wood burned fast unless you slowed it down. That smoke could be a blessing if you bent it, not fled from it. And that a single ember, if trapped just right beneath earth and air, could outlast every hearth on the prairie. They walked off eventually, spitting jokes, saying she'd probably freeze the kids by Christmas or cave the cabin in with her burrow chimney. But she didn't bother watching them go. She was already back inside, crouching near the low rock lip where the first vent opened into the room. A gentle warmth pulsed up. It was slow, but it was steady. And that night, while the wind turned cruel and snow drifted, knee-deep past the thresholds of every settler within 10 miles, the widow's children slept barefoot under quilts. The floor was warm, the walls stayed dry, and when her daughter woke in the middle of the night and reached out, the wooden floorboard beneath her felt like spring soil, not death. But no one knew yet. Not really. That would come later, after the storm, after the thaws failed, after the men who had laughed came back in desperation, eyes sunken, cheeks burned raw with frost, asking, not mocking, but asking. And by then the stove would no longer be a curiosity. It would be salvation. It had started weeks earlier, with a hole, not in the ground, but in her heart. That's what she told herself when she first began clawing at the corner of the cabin floor, pulling up pine planks with the back of a hammer she'd inherited from her husband's kit. He never used it much. He was the kind of man who preferred buying than building. She'd been the one to dig the latrine trench, the one to cut sod, to shape the logs, to shape the clay. And now she was shaping heat. She didn't have much to work with, just what nature gave and what men discarded. Clay from the creek bed 2 miles down the hill, straw from a broken mattress in the shed, rocks from the southern slope where her boy had once tried to find fossils, and mud, so much mud. She mixed it in an old wash tub, kneading it with her arms elbow deep until it turned smooth, thick like bread dough, but heavier. It felt honest in her hands. The neighbors didn't notice then, not until the structure took shape, not until the arch began to form just beneath the cabin wall, hidden from view, except if you happened to walk past close and smell the damp earth curing. She didn't use nails, didn't trust them. They split the wood and rusted anyhow. She used twine and rock weight and the logic of pressure, built it low and wide, like a tunnel, not a tower. The chamber itself was nearly horizontal, a long shelf-like box below the floor, lined with smooth stones, and a rear flue angled just right to trap smoke long enough to heat the whole run. She'd studied animal dens for it, how warmth lingered in burrows long after the beast had fled. That's what she wanted. Not a flame that roared and died, but a ghost of fire that stayed, something that mimicked nature instead of fighting it. By the time she lit the first test fire, the walls were hard, not brick hard, but baked enough by time and sun to hold. She didn't even use good wood, just scraps, bark, kindling, mossy sticks that snapped in her fingers. The glow rose slow, took nearly an hour before it reached the inner chamber, and when it did, it filled the room not with flame but with a breath of warmth, subtle, even, real. It was her daughter who noticed first. Sitting on the floor by the old mended chair, She blinked and said, "Mama, the floor's hot." She hadn't expected it to work that well, not on the first go, but it had. Somehow the fire's heat had traveled across the stone-lined trench beneath, curling up through the vented gaps she'd left deliberately unsealed, radiating into the cabin like it had a mind. She sat down next to her daughter, touched the board. Warm, not scalding, not even hot, but warm enough to matter. They didn't tell anyone, not right away. It became their secret through the first storm. She used almost no wood that week, just slow-fed scraps and moss bricks she'd shaped weeks ago and left drying behind the shed. And still, the warmth held. She slept curled near the stove, hand on the lid. It felt like touching hope. That was when the laughter came, after the second storm, when the neighbors saw the chimney stub half buried in earth and thought it a failure. She let them think that, because winter hadn't truly started yet. Not the bad part, not the desperate part, not the part where men ran out of firewood and women cried in silence when their children's lips turned blue. But it was coming, and when it did, that little clay and rock stove, built by a woman they'd all called foolish, would hold fire longer than any of theirs, and she wouldn't keep the secret forever, but she'd choose when to share it, and with whom. The first true death of winter came on the heels of that mocking laughter. It arrived with the stillness, the kind of bitter hush that settled over the high plains when the wind grew too exhausted to blow, and the snow, instead of falling, simply hovered in the air like it had forgotten how to land. That week, even the men stopped talking. The sky turned the color of pewter, and every tree seemed carved from brittle glass. The cold had no sound, but it pushed against the chest like grief. And inside her cabin, the widow, who had no name in the mouths of town men other than that one, or her, or the fool who plays with dirt, fed her stove no more than a single armful of dry moss and bark, just enough to keep the chamber low-breathing, a warm lung beneath the floorboards. She didn't stoke it, she didn't open it much. There was no flame to dance and comfort, only the slow, invisible burn of heat through stone and mud, which radiated outward like an old story retold by memory instead of voice. Her daughter no longer asked why they kept the lanterns dim, or why her mother refused to put the kettle directly over flame. The warmth came up from below. It wrapped them. It never roared, never smoked, never coughed into the room like the neighbor stoves did. It didn't need tending at all hours. It simply breathed, and because of it, they slept. But outside, something was changing. The world grew brittle. Men with chopped pine stacked to their rafters found themselves chewing through stores twice as fast as last winter. Wood, they said, was burning too quickly, wasn't dry enough, wasn't good enough. They blamed each other, blamed God, blamed the trees themselves for being too light. One man, Larson, the same man who'd flicked his chew on her porch, tried mixing in peat dug from the frozen bog east of the creek. It smothered his hearth with wet smoke. Another tried drying pine bark over open flame, only to have it catch and turn half his pile to ash. They got desperate fast, and in that kind of cold, desperation had sharp teeth. When the first child died, the town doctor blamed the fever, but everyone else knew it was the cold, and that's when the widow's stove, once the subject of ridicule, now the subject of whispered rumors, began to haunt the thoughts of those very same men who had mocked it, because unlike the rest of them, she wasn't seen outside chopping. She didn't beg for coal. She wasn't seen scavenging the brush line or trading preserves for firewood. In fact, she was seen hardly at all. Her windows glowed faintly at dusk. Her children were glimpsed now and again, rosy, laughing, faces unchapped. No smoke belched from her chimney like the others, and yet they lived. They didn't just survive. They were warm. Larson came first. He didn't knock. He lingered. He waited down the hill one day while her daughter was dragging in a sack of dry lichen from the woodshed. He didn't speak at first, just nodded, eyes tracking the frost-free breath on her lips, the loosened scarf at her collar. When he finally walked up, hat in hand, she stood in the doorway, same way as before. But this time he didn't laugh. He cleared his throat like a boy about to confess. He muttered, shifting. You got something going in there? Don't know what or how, but my boys, they're sick. One can't stop shaking. And my wife, she says maybe you got a trick with the stove. She didn't move. She didn't soften, but something in her eyes flickered. I told you it was a joke, he added, embarrassed. Guess the joke's on me now. She didn't answer, just opened the door wider, not enough to let him in, but enough for the warm breath of air to spill out and curl around his boots. His eyes went wide. You ain't burning? He said, bewildered. No, she finally said. Not like you are. And she closed the door gently, not cruelly, but like a mother putting a child back to sleep. He left without anger, just confusion, but word spread faster than frost. The next night, 2 more men knocked. The following day, the preacher came, not to mock, to pray. He offered wood in exchange for knowledge. She declined both, because her warmth had come at a cost they hadn't seen. She'd buried part of herself in that stove. Her hope, her grief, her husband's memory, all of it packed into the clay, mixed with the ash of the old bedposts he'd built, sealed with the smoke of nights spent alone after he'd taken fever and died whispering apologies for not chopping more wood before his legs gave out. That stove wasn't just her invention. It was her reckoning. She hadn't built it to show anyone. She hadn't built it to mock men or prove them wrong. She'd built it because the year before, her son had nearly died in her arms, and she had sworn to the dark rafters of that cabin that she would never let cold steal from her again. But still, she saw their eyes, and she knew what kind of man the cold could make. Proud ones turned desperate, desperate ones turned dangerous. So she decided, not all at once, but gradually, to teach. Not everyone, but someone, just one. A woman maybe, someone who might listen. It was Miriam she chose, a widow herself, younger, with no children, but a limp from polio, and a voice quiet enough to trust. She came by to trade 2 jars of preserved carrots for flour. The widow gave her the flour, and something more. "You still got that root cellar?" she asked. Miriam nodded. "You got the slope behind it still dry?" Another nod. "Then come back tomorrow," the widow said. "Bring gloves." And that was how it started. 2 women crouched in dirt, one explaining stone placement with gestures and sticks, the other listening with the silence of someone who'd learned that silence could save a life. They worked in secret. The snow helped, covered tracks, dampened sound. Every day Miriam learned. She saw how the vent angled slightly upward so the smoke lingered low, heating the trench before it escaped. She saw how the stones weren't random, how smooth ones carried heat longer, how porous ones breathed it out. She learned how fire was coaxed, not forced, how to burn moss until it turned into something slower than flame. She even learned to pack the chamber with charred bark to create a coal bed that lasted overnight without smoke. And when she built her own, smaller, shallower, less ambitious, but made with the same principles, it worked. Not perfectly, not instantly, but enough. The day her floor warmed for the first time, she cried. Word didn't spread this time. Not out loud, but women talk in ways men don't hear, with glances, with shared baskets, with pauses in conversation where understanding lives. Soon there were 3 stoves, then 4, all different, all built low, all quiet. The men noticed eventually. They weren't stupid, just blind in the ways men often are. And that was when things changed. Some grew resentful, said the women were hoarding something, said they were being secretive, like witches, said it wasn't natural, this quiet fire, that it was against God to burn things that didn't even smoke. Others begged. One man, child in arms, stood weeping on the widow's porch as his wife died in the sled behind him. The widow took the child, brought her in, fed her broth, sat her near the vent, and when her cheeks flushed again with life, she gave the man nothing but his child back, and the knowledge that warmth wasn't bought but built. He didn't understand at first, but he tried. Some men never did. The town split, not with anger but with distance. Those who mocked stayed cold. Those who listened found heat. And by the end of that winter, the cruelest in living memory, it was said, softly and never in public, that the women had saved more lives than the preacher's sermons and the doctor's pills combined. All because one widow, in the silence of her own grief, decided not to chase the flame, but to trap its ghost in stone and earth and patience. And her stove, the one built of mud and sorrow, kept burning long after the last log in town turned to ash. The end of January came with a silence that wasn't just from the cold, it was from surrender. The kind of quiet that fell when pride had already been broken, when mouths that once ran with opinion now pressed shut beneath frostbitten mustaches and cracked lips. The whole settlement looked hollow. Chimneys still smoked, but the smoke had grown bitter, sluggish, often grey with wet failure. Doors stayed closed longer, faces were drawn thinner, and everywhere under that lifeless sky, the rumour of the widow's stove hung like fog no wind could scatter. The widow didn't gloat. She never once looked down the ridge and smiled at those who'd scoffed. She kept her hands busy, her children wrapped, her voice low. She added more stone to the second heat tunnel she was building, one that wrapped beneath the children's sleeping space now, a forked path of warmth, branching from the stove like a root system. The fire moved beneath the floor like blood in a body, slow, unseen but vital. Her son, who once woke shivering and soaked with fever, now slept with his mouth slightly open, the warmth curling against his breath like spring against the edge of a dream. And yet, it wasn't just survival anymore. The second stove had changed things, because while the first had been born of desperation, the second came from choice, from design, from a growing understanding of heat not as a force to be battled but as something to be shaped. guided. It wasn't firewood she was building with anymore. It was principle, pattern. She wasn't warming her home the way settlers did. She was building a system that lived alongside them, under them, hidden and enduring. It was the preacher's wife who said it aloud first. "She's building a new kind of hearth," she whispered to her husband, cupping her hands near their barely burning stove. "Not a flame to look at, a warmth to live in." He didn't respond, not because he disagreed, but because he knew how deeply that truth undermined everything they thought made a house civilized. Their homes had windows, mantels, high chimneys for smoke and pride. The widow's had neither glory nor grandness, but it had warmth, and in winter only warmth mattered. The town began to splinter quietly, not in violence, not in rebellion, but in respect. At first it was women, then children, then the men who had less to prove. They came in ones and twos, knocking not on her door, but on Miriam's, or Elsa's, or the new woman Fran, whose husband had left for supplies and never returned. They asked for advice, for diagrams scratched into breadboards, for directions to that creek bed where the clay still ran soft beneath the snow if you dug just deep enough. They bartered buttons, wool, even prayers, and the women shared, not as a secret anymore, but as a promise, that if the earth could be hollowed and shaped with care, it would give back heat without demanding trees. That fire, hidden and slowed, could last all night with barely a whisper. That what the widow had built wasn't just a stove, it was a defiance, a quiet, practical defiance that made every woman feel just a little less at the mercy of things she couldn't control. But not everyone was grateful. There were men who saw the change and mistook it for insult, who watched the slow rise of moss-packed flues behind cabins and felt their worth diminish with every brick not laid by their own hand. They muttered that the stoves weren't natural, that the warmth was borrowed from something wrong, that it would catch up to them, that it was sorcery, and one man decided to prove it. His name was Pike, the kind of settler who'd come west because no one east would listen to him anymore. He had the look of someone who had survived everything but grace, lean, leathery, with eyes that twitched too fast, and hands that trembled even when they weren't cold. He'd built his own home with logs borrowed from trees he didn't fell himself, claimed land no one had challenged, and he watched that winter with envy chewing a hole through his chest. When his firewood ran out, he didn't ask for help, he stole it, and when the wind took down his chimney in a storm, he didn't rebuild, he blamed. "Those buried stoves," he muttered at the general store. "They're cursed. They trap poison. That's why she don't let you look inside. That's why there's no smoke, because what's in there ain't natural." The storekeeper, old Denham, looked up slowly. "Don't need smoke to warm a bed," he said. "My grandchild slept through last night without coughing once. That stove saved her." Pike spat. "That ain't fire," he said. "It's witchcraft with clay." And then he made a choice no man had dared yet. He marched up to the widow's home on the coldest night of February and tried to tear the stove apart. He came with a crowbar and a half-empty bottle of corn mash, stumbled through her garden plot frozen under snow, kicked in a vent with his boot, and began shouting, not words that made sense, just noise, the kind of noise pride makes when it's cracking in the wind. But the widow had heard him coming. She'd been awake, as she often was, tending the fire from inside not with wood, but with patience, adjusting the coals, repacking the ash dome, listening to the whisper of heat through her hidden channels. And when she heard his steps crunching the snow, she didn't light a lantern. She didn't panic. She opened the door before he could swing. The light from inside fell over him like an accusation or a blessing. He stopped, confused. The warmth hit him in the face like a confession. There was no roaring fire, no smoke, no flame, just that deep, even heat that wrapped around the bones and made the night forget itself. "What are you doing, Pike?" she asked. He blinked, shivered, and then said, not proudly but like a boy caught stealing bread, "You're hiding something. That's not a stove. It's not right." She didn't raise her voice. She just stepped aside. "Come in," she said. He did. He stood inside her cabin for a long time, shoulders shaking, eyes darting from wall to floor to vent. He saw the children asleep, barefoot. He saw the quilt hanging just over the stone box lip. He saw the glow of warmth without source. He even bent down and touched the floorboards. "They're hot," he said softly. She nodded. "Why?" "Because I built it that way." He looked at her then, truly looked, and he saw a woman who had been broken once, then bent herself back into shape with clay and grief and will. He dropped the crowbar. "I'm sorry," he said, not loudly, but real. She closed the door behind him, not to keep him in, but to keep the cold out, and that was the last time anyone in the settlement tried to tear a stove apart. From then on, there were no more secrets. The widow held a gathering. Not a meeting, not a sermon, just a gathering. She invited anyone who wanted to learn. Men, women, old, young. She showed them the stones, the airflow, the way the moss worked when packed wet and cured over heat. She explained why high chimneys wasted energy and why digging down kept heat from fleeing. She let them ask. She let them touch. And something changed. The men no longer saw the stove as a challenge to their pride. They saw it as an answer to their failure, a way to admit they didn't know everything, and that maybe, just maybe, a woman alone in a cabin had figured out something greater than firewood. By March, there were 17 stoves built in her style, some imperfect, some brilliant. One boy built his into a sled and kept his grandmother warm on the road. And when the snow finally melted, and the first green tips of crocus rose through the thawed dirt, it wasn't smoke that marked the return of spring. It was silence, a warm, even silence, born from earth, lit with ash, sustained by the stubborn hope of a woman no one ever again dared to laugh at. The thaw came late that year, the kind of late that made old men question their calendars and young mothers second-guess their lard stores. Even in the first days of March, the sky stayed white and woolly, like a lid pressed down over the world. Trees didn't bud, rivers didn't break. What melt there was came reluctantly, inch by inch, like the land itself was too worn down to start over. But inside the widow's cabin, the change had already taken hold, not just in temperature, but in rhythm. The stove was no longer an experiment, nor a marvel. It had become routine, a part of their lives as regular as breath, as ordinary as bread. Her children no longer noticed the absence of a roaring flame. They noticed warmth, constant, clean, deep. That floor, once cold and splintery beneath their feet, now felt like safety. And the widow herself, she'd changed too. She moved differently now, not faster, not harder, but with the quiet assurance of someone who had been ignored and doubted, and still come through not just intact, but triumphant. She no longer waited for anyone to ask her how she'd done it. They came on their own now, and not just from her town. Word had spread beyond the hills that a woman, some called her a mason of heat, others simply her, had found a way to make warmth last all night with only scraps. That she'd built fire not to burn, but to stay. And that during the freeze, while cabins cracked and stoves roared, and still gave up nothing but cold by dawn, her house had held its breath in warmth like it remembered summer. By mid-March, 2 men rode in from Riddell's Gulch, 5 days south. One was missing 2 fingers. The other, the better speaker, said they'd heard from a peddler who'd passed through and spent one warm night at Elsa's place, and that the warmth came from the ground itself. They didn't ask for hospitality. They asked for drawings, blueprints, instructions. The widow gave them none, but she invited them in, told them to sit by the vent and close their eyes. Then she asked them to guess where the fire was. Neither could. When she opened the floor hatch, just a modest slab of split pine hiding the burn box, they blinked down at a glowing bed of moss bricks and layered bark coal. It wasn't fire they saw, it was the ghost of one, and yet the room was warm. Don't need blueprints, she told them, just need to look down instead of up. They stayed 3 days, then left with nothing but what they remembered. That was enough. Others came, some from distant posts, a woman from 2 valleys over who'd lost her son in the freeze and refused to lose another, a trader from the east who offered flint and grain and bolts of colored cloth in exchange for even a small chamber design. She gave him nothing but this: dig deep, burn slow, let the earth help. It wasn't stinginess, it was principle, because the widow had begun to understand something larger. The stove wasn't just a way to warm a cabin, it was a way to change how they lived, how they thought about comfort, about fire, about each other. See, fire, the old kind, had always needed to be watched. It demanded a presence. Someone had to feed it, sit by it, guard it. And so the cabin bent around it. People shaped their lives around the need to be near flame, to serve it. It made them fearful, dependent. But her stove, it reversed that. It gave heat freely, without demanding company. It lived in the floor, not on the hearth. It made the air breathe, not choke, and it asked for almost nothing in return. For the first time, women could rest. They didn't have to hunch and tend and stoke. They could sleep. They could leave the room. They could dream without fear of waking to a dead flame and a child's blue lips. The community, it shifted. They didn't notice it at first, but it showed in small things, in how women started meeting outside, even on cold days, sharing bundles of that moss she taught them to cure, in how men no longer argued over wood piles because they needed less, in how the general store started stocking bricks of bark instead of logs, in how the children stopped coughing in the mornings. And then one day a stranger came not to learn, but to challenge. He arrived on a black mule with a broad hat and the smell of coal on his coat, called himself Mr. Dreel, said he worked for a heating concern out of Abilene. He'd heard the miracle tales, he said, wanted to know what was being sold, what was the trick. The widow wasn't home when he came. Her daughter met him on the porch. "She ain't selling anything," the girl said, calm. "It's not a trick." "Then what is it?" he asked, squinting. "You can't change physics Just 'cause you're cold, the girl only shrugged. Mama says most men don't understand heat. They just chase fire. He didn't like that, not one bit. That night, he went around to every home in the hollow, offering money. Not much, but enough. Promised to pay for plans, for measurements, for even a peek inside. Most said no. One man said yes, a newcomer who hadn't built one yet. Driel left with nothing useful. The next morning, he tried to dig up one of the tunnels near Fran's cabin while she was out. He didn't get far. The frost held the stone so tight he shattered his chisel. And when he came stomping back into town, cursing about hidden tricks and primitive magic, the sheriff himself told him to leave. "This ain't your kind of heat," the sheriff said. "This is hers." It was the first time a man had said it out loud. Hers. Not borrowed, not stolen, not owed, hers. And that evening, when the sun finally broke through the thick sky and cast a golden shaft over the ridge, the widow stepped out and saw the light catch the curve of her stove's vent like a crown. She didn't cry, but she smiled. The kind of smile you don't show anyone, because it's not for them. It's for the road that brought you here, for the hands that bled, shaping earth, for the fire that learned to stay quiet and last longer, for what it means to build something no one believes in, and watch it save lives anyway. There was one more storm before spring, a late squall, sudden and fierce, the kind that howls out of nowhere and tries to remind the world who's in charge. The settlers were ready this time. Most had their floor stoves built, some only halfway finished, but it didn't matter. They'd learned enough. The vents were warm before nightfall. The moss bricks burned low. The rooms held. No one froze. Not a single child coughed. And when the snow blew past and the sun returned, the town gathered in the widow's yard, not for a meeting, but for a meal. They brought root vegetables, dried venison, half loaves, dried berries. No one said thank you. They didn't have to. It was known. The fire pit outside her home stayed cold. The warmth came from within. As the sun set, someone began humming a song from the old country. Others joined. The children ran barefoot in the frost, and the widow sat quietly on her stoop, her hands in her lap, watching not what she had built, but what had built itself because of it. Not a new stove, a new way, one that couldn't be sold or stolen, only shared. Spring didn't arrive with the celebration. It didn't crash through the clouds with birdsong or scatter blossoms on the hills. It crept, slowly, like someone returning to a place they weren't sure they belonged anymore. The frost stayed longer in the shadowed hollows. The snow turned to slush and held its ground in stubborn pockets beneath the trees. The air softened only by degrees, and even then, reluctantly. But within the settlement, along those dirt paths now tamped hard from a winter of trudging boots and sled runners, life began to reassemble itself. The market reopened. Chickens wandered again. People laughed, though not loud yet. The laughter was quiet, as if still remembering who didn't make it through the freeze. 8 graves had been dug that winter. 8 too many, but it could have been more. Everyone knew it. And the reason it hadn't been more sat crouched in the shade of her shed, hands covered in damp clay, shaping the base of yet another vent stone for a neighbor's new stove. The widow didn't lead the town now, not officially. There were still men, with titles and opinions and land deeds, who made the loud decisions. But whenever something real needed fixing, when someone asked how to line a trench with firestone, or how to patch a moss crack so it wouldn't leak smoke, they came to her. They didn't ask if it was proper anymore. They didn't pretend it wasn't hers. They just asked, and she answered. But for all her calm and quiet, she had been thinking about the day she'd have to stop. Because a system only works if it's passed on. She'd taught the women who asked. She'd guided the men who humbled themselves. But now the season had turned, and already folks were forgetting what it had been like at the bottom of the cold. Firewood was drying again. Sunlight touched the walls. There was talk of rebuilding old chimneys. There was always talk. The widow knew. Memory faded faster than frost. So she began writing. Not letters, not ledgers, but drawings, notes, etchings into wood. She carved diagrams into boards with a nail, pressed symbols into soft clay before it hardened. She didn't know if they'd last, but she wanted them to. And one night, as she sat by the dim orange flicker of her own quiet stove, her daughter asked the question she'd known would come. "Mama, why do you build so many for other people?" The widow didn't answer right away. She stirred the moss brick fire, watched how the glow moved, how the heat flowed through the floor like memory itself. Then she said, "Because someday they'll forget it was me, but they'll still be warm." Her daughter nodded. She understood. By the end of that spring, the settlement had changed in ways no one could quite name. There were no grand speeches, no dedications, no monuments, but the new cabins being raised had no central hearths. They were built wider now, flatter, with dug-out hollows beneath the floors, prepared in advance for a different kind of stove. Children played in rooms that were warm without flame. Women walked further to gather herbs, now that they no longer needed to chop wood each morning. Men shared advice about how to shape clay instead of splitting logs. And though there were still arguments and storms and old bitterness, the kind that never fully leaves any place, there was also something new beneath it all. A quiet unity, a warmth that lingered. They called them ground fires now. Others came to learn, travelers from distant valleys, an entire group from the south who'd heard of the Mud Fire Queen. That name made the widow frown. She wasn't a queen. She was a mother with no more tears left to cry, and a cabin that wouldn't stop freezing. That's all. She taught them anyway. But she never left the hollow. One time, a man offered to pay her to come east, to teach a town of engineers about her stove, said she could make real money. She declined. "I didn't build it for gold," she said. "I built it for mornings." The years passed. Children grew. Some moved away, some stayed. The stoves stayed too. And when one winter came with less warning than usual, sharp, sudden, without the weeks of slush and softness that usually came first, no one panicked. They packed moss and bark into their stoves. They sealed the vents, and they slept, barefoot, in warm beds while the wind howled outside. No one really remembers when the widow passed. It wasn't during a freeze. It wasn't a storm, just a quiet evening after her son had returned from the north with his own children, and she had smiled to see them curl up on the warm floor near the vent. She went to sleep and didn't wake. They buried her, not with ceremony, but with clay in her hands, packed fresh from the creek she had dug from so many years before. The town marked her grave with a flat stone. Not grand, just honest. It read, "She caught the fire," and it stayed. And underneath that line, someone, her daughter perhaps, or one of the other women who had learned from her hands, carved a simple diagram, a tunnel, a chamber, a vent, and a line beneath it, "So you won't forget." Even now, generations on, when the weather grows cruel again, and the new settlers ask how to keep warm without smoke or waste, someone brings out the story, not of the widow, not directly. They just say, "There was someone once. She figured out how to burn slow, how to burn right, and in some cabins, far from any town, the floor is still warm long after the fire has gone out, because she built it that way, because she taught them to, because the fire didn't belong in the air. It belonged in the ground, held there, tended by memory, carried forward not in names or books or glory, but in how a child's toes stay warm on a winter morning. And that's enough. That's everything."